While you're checking expiration dates on your emergency food supply, wondering if those vacuum-sealed pouches are still safe after 3 years in the garage, there's a 30-year-old cache of pemmican sitting in an Arctic permafrost that you could eat today without hesitation. Modern military rations, engineered with billion-dollar budgets and sealed in space-age plastic, rot into toxic sludge within 5 years. 2 ingredients mixed on the Great Plains centuries ago remain chemically stable for decades. The difference isn't technology, it's understanding what makes food fail in the first place, and the indigenous engineers who made pemmican understood material chemistry at a level modern food science still hasn't matched. Every MRE package carries a stamp that reads, "Best if used by date when stored at 80 degrees Fahrenheit or below." That qualification isn't fine print, it's the entire architecture of the lie. Store those same rations in a vehicle trunk during summer, where temperatures routinely hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the 5-year shelf life collapses to roughly 1 month. The chemistry doesn't care about your storage intentions. Heat accelerates molecular breakdown. Water trapped inside the pouch reacts with fats and proteins. The food is digesting itself. The military knows this. Internal testing documents show MRE degradation rates at various temperatures, but the packaging label lists only the Wissundi ideal condition timeline. A soldier deployed to Kuwait, storing rations in a metal Connexex container where interior temperatures reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit, isn't getting 5 years. They're getting weeks before the entree turns to paste and the fats go rancid. The labeled shelf life assumes climate control that doesn't exist in the field. Pemmican caches documented in Arctic exploration records tell a different story. Roald Amundsen left emergency food stores buried in permafrost during his Northwest Passage expedition. Subsequent parties recovered those caches decades later, meat and fat still separated into clean layers, no rancid odor, fully edible. No expiration date was needed because the chemistry was dormant. The comparison isn't close. One preservation system assumes ideal laboratory conditions that never exist in reality. The other system was designed for the worst conditions on Earth and performs flawlessly under them. The modern survival food industry built its model on sterile packaging and chemical additives. Indigenous food engineers built theirs on eliminating the variables that cause rot. When you remove water entirely and seal nutrients in crystallized fat, there's no reaction pathway left for degradation. Modern rations fight entropy. Pemmican was removed from the battlefield. The engineering decisions that make pemmican stable for decades begin before the animal is even harvested. Indigenous processors, primarily women in plains tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Blackfoot, understood bison anatomy with surgical precision. They didn't render random fat. They targeted hard fat exclusively, the kidney suet and back loin deposits. This wasn't tradition, it was materials science. Suet is biochemically distinct from the soft fat marbled through muscle tissue. Its lipid profile is dominated by stearic acid, a saturated fatty acid with no double bonds in its carbon chain. That molecular structure crystallizes into a solid at room temperature and remains stable up to 63 degrees Celsius before melting. Muscle fat, by contrast, contains higher concentrations of unsaturated fatty acids, oleic acid, linoleic acid, which have double bonds that break in the presence of oxygen, triggering the chain reaction called rancidity. Soft fat also has a lower melting point, which means it doesn't form a stable matrix, it bleeds oil. Modern protein bars and emergency rations use whatever fat is cheapest to source, typically a blend that includes muscle fat and hydrogenated vegetable oils. The result is predictable: oil bleed, where liquid fat separates out and soaks through packaging, and oxidation that turns the bar rancid within months, even when sealed. Indigenous engineers made the opposite choice. By exclusively harvesting suet, they selected for a fat that naturally resists oxidation and solidifies into a protective casing. The decision wasn't about flavor, it was about exploiting the crystallization properties of saturated lipids to create a hermetic barrier that doesn't require refrigeration. The same precision is applied to the meat itself. Only the leanest muscle cuts were used, hams and loins with all exterior fat and connective tissue surgically removed. This seems counterintuitive. Fat is calorie-dense, Why remove it? Because fat embedded within muscle, fiber oxidizes faster than separated, rendered fat. The lipids are in direct contact with iron-rich heme proteins, which catalyze rancidity. By isolating lean protein, processors eliminated the primary spoilage vector before the drying process even began. Modern jerky keeps the fat for moisture and flavor, then compensates with nitrates and preservatives to slow the inevitable rot. Indigenous method: remove the problem, not the symptom. All food preservation is a fight against water. Bacteria, molds, and the chemical reactions that break down nutrients all require moisture to function. The microbiology is precise. Bacteria need a water activity level, designated AW, above 0.85 to reproduce. Molds can survive slightly drier conditions, down to AW 0.70. Below AW 0.60, biological activity stops. Not slows. Stops. The environment is too dry for cellular processes to occur. Water activity measures the availability of water molecules for biological and chemical reactions, not just the total moisture content. A food can contain significant water but have low AW if that water is bound to salts or sugars. Conversely, a food with modest total moisture can have high AW if the water is free and accessible. Pemmican targeted both metrics: low total moisture and low free water availability. Pemmican meat was dried to that threshold. Processors sliced lean muscle into thin sheets, typically less than 6 mm thick, and hung them in the sun or over low smoke fires. The target wasn't leathery or chewy, it was brittle. When the meat snapped cleanly under hand pressure, it was dry enough. That physical test, the crisp point, was a tactile proxy for water activity measurement. Once the jerky reached that state, it was pounded into a powder using stone pestles or the flat of a hatchet. The powder form wasn't aesthetic. It maximized surface area, ensuring that no pockets of residual moisture remained trapped in the fiber matrix. The final product registered below AW 0.60. At that level, chemistry is impossible. Compare that to modern MREs. The retort process, where food is sealed in plastic and pressure cooked at 121 degrees Celsius, sterilizes the contents, killing all bacteria and spores. But the food itself retains 60 to 70% water content. The AW sits somewhere between 0.95 and 0.98, well within the range where microbes can thrive if the seal is breached. The pouch isn't preservation, it's quarantine. As long as the circular barrier holds and no heat accelerates internal reactions, the food remains safe. But the chemistry inside is active. Water molecules are in contact with fats and proteins, and over time, hydrolysis occurs. Water splits triglycerides into glycerol and free fatty acids, rancid, sour-tasting compounds. It breaks peptide bonds in proteins, turning firm textures into a slurry. This is the fundamental divide. Pemmican is chemically dormant because it contains almost no water. MREs are chemically active because they do. One system removed the reagent, the other tries to slow the reaction with packaging and additives, then labels it with a shelf life that only applies under ideal conditions. No one can guarantee. The defining step in pemmican production is the mix. Rendered tallow, liquid fat purified by heating suet to 120 degrees Celsius, is poured over the powdered dry meat in a 1-to-1 ratio by weight. That proportion isn't arbitrary. It represents the maximum amount of protein surface area that can be coated per unit of fat without leaving dry spots exposed to oxygen. The rendering process itself is critical. Raw suet contains not just fat, but connective tissue, residual blood, and water trapped in cellular structures. Heating it to 120 degrees Celsius serves multiple functions. The fat liquefies and separates from the solid impurities, water evaporates completely, and lipase enzymes, the biological catalysts that normally break down fats, denature and become inactive. What's poured off is chemically pure tallow, sterile and stable. The leftover solids, called cracklings, are discarded or fed to dogs. This purification step is why rendered tallow can sit at room temperature indefinitely while raw fat spoils in days. The mechanism is specific. Liquid tallow has low viscosity at high temperatures, allowing it to flow into the microscopic voids and crevices of the meat powder. As the mixture cools, the tallow undergoes a phase change. The stearic acid molecules align into a crystalline lattice, solidifying around each protein granule. The result is not a blend, it's suspension technology. Each particle of meat is encased in its own lipid shell, isolated from atmospheric oxygen the way an insect is preserved in amber. This is molecular-level encapsulation. Oxygen is required for oxidation, the chemical process that turns fats rancid and degrades proteins. By coating every surface in solidified fat, Pemmican eliminates oxygen contact. There is no air pathway to the interior. Modern vacuum sealing attempts the same goal with external barriers. Remove air from the package, heat seal the plastic, and hope the pouch doesn't puncture. But the protection is extrinsic. If the package fails, the food is exposed. Pemmican's protection is intrinsic. The barrier is built into the food matrix itself at a granular scale, and it doesn't depend on a fragile plastic film remaining intact for years. Modern protein bars use binders and emulsifiers to hold ingredients together, soy lecithin, glycerin, gar gum, but these additives are hydrophilic. They attract and retain moisture, so the bar's interior remains sufficiently wet to prevent slow degradation. The texture stays soft because the AW is too high. Pemmican is rock hard at room temperature because it's genuinely dry and the fat matrix is solid. That hardness is proof of stability, not a defect. The Arrhenius equation governs the temperature dependence of chemical reaction rates. The simplified principle: for every 10 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, reaction rates roughly double. This applies to all degradation pathways: oxidation, hydrolysis, and enzymatic breakdown. It's not a suggestion, it's thermodynamics. MRE shelf life ratings are calculated at a baseline storage temperature of 21 degrees Celsius. Under those conditions, the hydrolysis reactions that turn fats into rancid acids and break down protein structures proceed slowly enough that the food remains edible for approximately 5 years. But raise the temperature to 38 degrees Celsius, a common condition inside a vehicle trunk, military supply depot, or emergency storage shed during summer, and the reaction rate accelerates dramatically. The 5-year shelf life collapses to roughly 1 month. At 50 degrees Celsius, which is easily reached in a closed car under direct sunlight, degradation occurs in weeks. The chemistry is straightforward. The hydrolysis accelerates, water cleaving more triglycerides, breaking more peptide bonds, producing more rancid acids, and texture collapse. Simultaneously, vitamins degrade. Thiamine and riboflavin are heat sensitive. Extended exposure to elevated temperatures destroys them, leaving the MRE nutritionally depleted even if it's technically safe to eat. The retort process already degrades vitamin content during sterilization. Heat storage finishes the job. This degradation is cumulative and irreversible. An MRE stored at 38 degrees Celsius for 1 month doesn't return to like-new status if moved to cooler storage. The chemical damage is permanent. Bonds that have broken don't reassemble. Vitamins that have degraded don't regenerate. The countdown runs in one direction. Pemmican remains stable across the same temperature range because the chemistry is different. The moisture content is below 5%, which means hydrolysis cannot occur at meaningful rates. There's insufficient water to act as a reactant. The fat matrix is solid up to 63 degrees Celsius, so even in extreme heat, the lipid encapsulation remains intact. Surface oxidation can occur. Oxygen in contact with the outermost layer of fat will slowly degrade it over years. But that degradation is scrapable. The interior remains protected. The system degrades from the outside in at a rate measured in decades, not months. Field testing confirms this. Arctic explorers in the early 20th century, Shackleton, Scott, Amundsen, documented that European canned goods frequently failed due to botulism from imperfect seals or exploded from freeze-thaw cycles. Pemmican stored in the same conditions showed no degradation. Amundsen's sled dogs consumed pemmican rations that had been cached for years with no digestive issues. The reliability gap wasn't marginal, it was categorical. Even if you solve the food chemistry, the packaging can undermine everything. Modern MRE pouches are constructed from multi-layer plastic laminates designed for zero permeability. No oxygen enters, no moisture escapes. This seems ideal until you account for what's already inside. If the retort process doesn't fully sterilize the food, if a single bacterial spore survives, it will eventually germinate once temperatures rise. The sealed environment becomes an incubator. Additionally, any moisture generated by chemical breakdown, say from fats hydrolyzing into glycerol and water, becomes trapped inside the pouch. That moisture condenses on the food surface during temperature fluctuations, accelerating further hydrolysis. The hermetic seal that's supposed to protect the food traps the byproducts of its own degradation. The plastic itself degrades over time. UV exposure breaks down polymer chains, making the material brittle. Mechanical stress during transport creates micro-tears along seal edges. Repeated temperature cycling causes expansion and contraction that fatigues the laminate layers. Each of these failure modes is accelerated by heat. An MRE stored at elevated temperatures doesn't just suffer food degradation, the package integrity deteriorates simultaneously. The parfleche, a rawhide case used to store pemmican, operates on different physics. Rawhide is buffalo hide that has been de-haired, stretched, and dried without tanning. The collagen fiber structure creates a semi-permeable membrane. Liquid water cannot penetrate due to surface tension. Rain beads off the exterior. But water vapor can pass through the microscopic pores in the collagen matrix. If any moisture forms inside the parfleche due to temperature changes, it vents outward rather than condensing back onto the food. The container breathes. This selective permeability is critical in environments with high temperature variation. During the day on the plains, air temperatures can reach 35 degrees Celsius. At night, they drop to 10 degrees Celsius. Inside a sealed plastic pouch, that temperature swing would cause water vapor to condense on the food surface, creating localized wet spots that initiate spoilage. Inside a parfleche, the vapor escapes through the hide before condensation occurs. Rawhide also provides thermal buffering. The thick hide has significant thermal mass, which moderates temperature swings. When external temperatures spike during the day, the parfleche heats slowly, preventing the rapid interior temperature rise that accelerates chemical reactions. At night, it cools slowly, preventing condensation. Plastic has almost no thermal mass. It reaches ambient temperature quickly, offering no protection against the temperature cycling that drives degradation. When fully dried, rawhide hardens to the density of wood. Rodents cannot chew through it. Insects cannot penetrate it. The mechanical durability far exceeds that of plastic, which becomes brittle over time due to UV exposure and oxidative degradation of the polymer chains. A parfleche stored in dry conditions can remain functional for decades. Plastic pouches develop micro-tears and seal failures within years, especially under mechanical stress during transport. The indigenous choice of packaging wasn't about availability. It was about designing a container whose material properties complemented the preservation strategy. The food is dry and stable. The container allows that dryness to be maintained without trapping entropy inside. The validation of pemmican as a superior technology didn't come from indigenous sources being taken at their word. It came from European institutions adopting it after their own systems failed catastrophically. During the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, European explorers initially relied on canned meats and preserved vegetables. Those supplies frequently caused botulism due to imperfect seals or scurvy due to vitamin loss during the canning process. Ernest Shackleton's endurance expedition switched to pemmican after earlier failures. Robert Falcon Scott's ill-fated Terra Nova expedition carried pemmican as the primary caloric source, despite Scott's personal distaste for it. Roald Amundson's successful South Pole expedition relied almost exclusively on pemmican for both human and dog teams. The Norwegian explorer later wrote that pemmican was the only food that remained palatable and nutritionally intact after months in sub-zero conditions. The performance difference was stark. British expeditions using canned goods suffered repeated incidents of food poisoning and nutritional deficiencies. Norwegian expeditions using pemmican reported no such issues. The food worked. It didn't leak, didn't freeze into unusable blocks, didn't lose nutritional value, and didn't spoil regardless of storage duration or temperature extremes. The Hudson's Bay Company, which controlled the North American fur trade from the late 1600s through the 1800s, standardized pemmican as the core logistical fuel of the trade network. A single piece of pemmican, a 90-pound rawhide sack, became the currency of long-distance transport. Voyageurs paddling canoes across thousands of miles of wilderness consumed roughly 1.5 pounds of pemmican per day. No other food provided equivalent caloric density in a form that didn't spoil during multi-month journeys. The company didn't adopt pemmican for cultural reasons. They adopted it because European alternatives, salted pork, hardtack, canned goods, couldn't match the performance. The company conducted its own comparative testing. Salted pork required barrels, which added weight and bulk to canoes already operating at capacity. The salt content caused excessive thirst, problematic on routes where potable water was scarce. Hardtack absorbed moisture and developed mold in humid climates. Canned goods were prohibitively heavy, and the cans frequently ruptured during portages. Pemmican solved all of these problems simultaneously. Maximum calories per pound, no spoilage, no water requirements, and packaging that doubled as a waterproof container. During the Boer War and World War I, British military command issued emergency rations based on pemmican formulations branded as iron rations. The acknowledgement was explicit. This was the only food concentrated enough and stable enough to sustain infantry during extended operations without resupply. Modern militaries eventually abandoned pemmican not because of spoilage or nutritional inadequacy, but because soldiers found it monotonous and demanded variety. The trade was convenient for reliability. A standard MRE contains more than 30 ingredients per entree. Scan the label. You'll find stabilizers like xanthan gum, emulsifiers like mono and diglycerides, preservatives like BHA and BHT, flavor enhancers like disodium inosinate, colorants like caramel color, and anti-caking agents like silicon dioxide. Each additive serves a function, preventing separation, extending shelf life, masking off flavors created by the retort process. But each additive is also a molecule that can degrade. BHA and BHT are antioxidants added to prevent fat rancidity, but they're heat sensitive. Prolonged exposure to elevated temperatures causes them to break down, at which point the fats they were supposed to protect begin oxidizing. Emulsifiers that keep sauces smooth at 21 degrees Celsius can separate or form crystals at higher temperatures, ruining texture. Gums that provide viscosity are hydrophilic. They hold water, which accelerates hydrolysis of surrounding ingredients. The complexity isn't sophistication, it's fragility. Every additional ingredient introduces another failure mode, another degradation pathway, another temperature sensitivity. The interaction effects multiply the problem. BHA might stabilize fats but degrades faster in the presence of certain acids. Emulsifiers might prevent separation but react with metal ions from the packaging, creating off flavors. Preservatives might inhibit bacterial growth but break down under UV light during storage. Each ingredient exists in a web of chemical relationships, and heat disrupts all of them simultaneously. Predicting long-term stability becomes a multivariate equation with dozens of variables. Pemmican contains two ingredients, lean meat and rendered suet. Some variations include dried berries, typically choke cherries or saskatoons, for flavor and vitamin C, but the preservation mechanism doesn't depend on them. The simplicity is structural. There are fewer molecules to degrade, fewer interactions to account for, fewer variables that heat and time can disrupt. The system is robust because it's minimal. This isn't primitivism, it's engineering elegance. Indigenous food scientists understood that reliability emerges from reducing complexity, not adding it. Modern food science assumes that problems can be solved by layering interventions. Add a preservative for this issue, a stabilizer for that one, an antioxidant for another. But each intervention creates dependencies and vulnerabilities. Pemmican took the opposite approach. Remove the variables that cause failure in the first place. No water means no microbial growth, and no hydrolysis. Saturated fat means no oxidation pathway. Lipid encapsulation means no oxygen contact. The result is a system that doesn't require active management. It's stable by design. The caloric density comparison makes the engineering gap explicit. Pemmican delivers approximately 800 calories per 100 grams. A standard MRE entree delivers roughly 150 calories per 100 grams. To carry equivalent energy, a soldier would need to pack more than 5 times the weight in MREs compared to pemmican. For expeditions measured in months or supply lines stretched across thousands of miles, that weight difference is mission critical. The accusation isn't subtle. Modern military nutrition programs spend billions on R&D, yet produce rations that degrade faster than a 2-ingredient food mixed on the plains centuries ago. The failure isn't technical, it's conceptual. Industrial food science is optimized for palatability, variety, and ease of manufacturing. Indigenous food science optimized for survival. One system assumes controlled conditions and short time horizons. The other assumes the worst possible conditions and indefinite storage. The performance gap reflects the difference in design priorities. There are still pemmican caches buried in permafrost that predate the invention of plastic. They remain edible. Meanwhile, emergency food stockpiles in climate-controlled warehouses are rotting before their printed expiration dates because a warehouse in July isn't climate-controlled. It's an oven. The contrast isn't a historical curiosity. It's an operational failure. Indigenous engineers on the Great Plains didn't have access to labs, spectrometers, or sterile packaging facilities. They had observation, empirical testing, and knowledge transmission across generations. They identified which fat crystallizes stably, which moisture threshold prevents microbial life, and which packaging allows vapor escape without moisture ingress. They built a preservation system that accounts for thermodynamics, microbiology, and material chemistry, not by naming those disciplines, but by mastering the principles. Modern survival food chases shelf life with industrial interventions, retort sterilization, chemical preservatives, hermetic seals. It achieves 5 years under ideal conditions and fails in weeks under real ones. Pemmican eliminated the need for interventions by removing the variables that drive degradation. The reliability isn't accidental. It's the outcome of superior engineering, applied without instruments, refined through necessity, and validated by centuries of performance in the harshest environments on Earth. The question isn't why pemmican lasts 30 years. It's why modern science still hasn't caught up.